Well, hello everyone, and a warm welcome to episode 48 of the Drunken Boxing Podcast, coming to you from the home of roast duck and 56% baijiu, Beijing. I hope you are all keeping well. Let's get right into it with some Mushin martial culture news. Last month, I attended a Chuojiao Fanzi Quan gathering in Li County of Hebei Province. My shifu, Di Guoyong, contacted me to attend this event and represent him, as he had been invited to attend this special event. Although I do not practice Chuojiao Fanzi Quan myself, my shifu did study under the famous Wu Binlou for some time, in addition to his primary studies of Xingyi Quan and Baguazhang. In fact, Wu Binlou and my Xingyi Quan grand teacher, Zhao Zhong, were good friends, and it was through this introduction that my teacher got to study the style under Master Wu Binlou in Beijing. A stele was being unveiled in Li County commemorating teachers and practitioners who contributed and spread the art of Chuojiao Fanzi Quan, which was and is still very popular in Li County. Incidentally, my shifu was also born in Li County, and this is where his family hails from. The event was also attended by the grandson of Lanshou Quan from Shanxi, who was a famous Xingyi Quan practitioner and disciple of Che Zhai. I made a short video where you can see some of the performances of Chuojiao and related styles at the event. I also released a new video in the Legacy of Baguazhang series. This video features history and investigation I did into the original palace of Prince Shou, which is where Donghai Chuan and his martial skills were first discovered. Compiling this video was quite an endeavor, as it required quite a bit of digging and research as well as field work. It introduces the area and history where Prince Shou's mansion was at that time and why it no longer exists there today, as well as showing you the area as it is today. So if this piece of living history interests you, go check it out. I have future Legacy of Baguazhang videos planned as well that will shed light on many of Baguazhang's interesting historical accounts, people, and places. I'm also very happy to announce, after close to a decade of constant work, my book, Dragon Body, Tiger Spirit, a translation and explanation of the classic texts of Xingyi Quan, will be released very soon. In this book, I not only translate, but I also explain in detail the classical texts of Xingyi Quan. While some of these texts have been translated in the past, many do not go into detail as to what the instruction means as they relate to the practice of Xingyi Quan. The classical texts of the art are indeed a guiding foundation regarding the essential aspects of the art's practice, and it is beneficial to have an understanding of their meaning. My teacher would require that I not only knew the texts themselves, but he would also explain their instructions as they relate to the practice itself. Throughout my training, I made an effort to study these and understand their deeper meaning, and the book is a culmination of those efforts. Apart from the commonly known classics, the book features first-time translations and explanations of lesser-known writings. The book is packed with technical information at 388 pages, with very few images. It also features a wonderful piece written by the great Jarek Szymanski regarding the art's complicated history. Leading up to the release, I have launched a website for Mushin martial culture in general. While the site is still under construction, you may visit the site and sign up to the newsletter to be kept informed as to the book's release and how you can get it. In future, the website will feature much more, so keep an eye out on that too. The URL is mushinmartialculture.com. As always, if you want to support this podcast or the Mushin martial culture endeavors in general, you may do so through our Patreon page. There are 2 general support tiers, and your pledges sincerely help me to continue doing these endeavors. Patreons also get access to exclusive content that is not released for the general public. Additionally, there is a 3rd tier, the Huajin tier, which is the in-depth online learning platform for the arts of authentic Hebei Xingyi Quan and Liang-style Baguazhang. It features over 100 in-depth lesson videos to date, with new lessons being added on a weekly basis. If you ever wanted to study these arts in a systematic and deep manner, and do not have access to a teacher directly, the program is one way to do it. The program can also be used to supplement and deepen your current study, as it is as well. You may find the learning program, as well as the Patreon support page at patreon.com/mushinmartialculture. That's all one word, Mushin Martial Culture. Your support is always greatly appreciated. Additionally, another way to support me is by visiting the Mushin Martial Culture Teespring merchandise store and getting some of the interesting merch available there. There are t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and posters available. The link is in the show description below. Purchasing some of our merchandise also helps keep the podcast and the channel running. So thank you to everyone who has supported me in these various ways. Alright, let's get into today's episode. My guest today is John Groschwitz, who I first heard of many years ago due to a book he published titled The Xingyi Boxing Manual, Hebei Style's 5 Principles and 7 Words. This is a translation of Jin Yunting's Republican-era Xingyi Manual, and it was one of the only such resources available in English at that time. He has since revised the book and re-released an expanded version of it. He also translated a Gao-Style Baguazhang manual by Gowie Shang and Liu Wanfu, titled The Cheng-School Gao-Style Baguazhang Manual, Gowie Shang's Bagua Twisting Body Connected Palm. This is yet another excellent book by Mr. Groschwitz, and a wonderful resource in general that I highly recommend. There are links to his books in the description below. I wanted to talk to him about his background, his training experiences, his practice, as well as his work on such books. So with that, I give you John Groschwitz. All right, welcome to the Drunken Boxing Podcast, Mr. John Groschwitz. I'm very happy and very honored to have you on today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, great. So you're currently in Japan, which is interesting. You're usually based out of the USA, though. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, Menlo Park specifically, and I happen to be in Tokyo this year. So here through probably July of 23.
Okay, so you're there for a bit of time, actually. That's very nice.
Yeah.
Well, for the listeners that don't know of you, I know of you through your works that you have done first and foremost on the translation of the Xingyi Boxing Manual, which was Jin Yunting's manual. You released 2 versions of those. You've also, if I'm not mistaken, you were involved in the Cheng-School Gao-Style Baguazhang manual, which was Gowie Shang's manual / Liu Wanfu's manual, that you assisted with the translation on that. Is that correct?
Yeah. I worked on all 3 of those, and I've been practicing various forms of martial arts now for close to 30 years. I've been doing the Gao-Style Bagua for a good chunk of that.
Okay. And what was the background? How did you get into it? Who did you study with? Well, you can just, take your time letting us know your background.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I started in the Bay Area in 1995, studying Northern Shaolin. And that was in the lineage of Wong Jackman with one of his students there in Berkeley. After a few years went by, we actually ended up in Wong Jackman's class and studied with Sifu Wong for another 7 years or so until he retired in 2005. But at the same time, I was very lucky to be introduced to a number of really interesting people. So around the same time that I started in the Northern Shaolin, I met Vince Black, who founded the North American Tang Dao Association and was teaching Xingyi and Bagua across the country at that point. Became a member of the association and started taking classes and seminars with him, and eventually became his student as well. And then had opportunity through him to go to China and study Lanshou Quan with Liu Wanfu in Tianjin, and studied some Liangjunpu Bagua through the association. Ended up studying Cheng-School Gao-Style Bagua, and then met Liu Shuhang, who also became my teacher, and studied Shen Long Xingyi with Vince and through the association, which comes through the Taiwan branch through Zhang Junfeng, and Hong Yishang, and Xu Hongji, and then was also introduced to a teacher in Shanxi, Li Runxi, who's the son of Li Guichang, and so also studied Shanxi style Xingyi. Also did Kajukenbo with Vince and water boxing. More recently, had the chance to study some Yang style Taiji with a teacher named Li Tang, who's also from Shandong. And and also study Jingluo Qigong with Li Ding, who's a doctor originally from Taiyuan.
All right. Well, that's quite an extensive background with quite a few, highly regarded people. I think I've had. You probably are the third person or guest that I've had on the podcast that has a connection to Vince Black throughout history. I've had Tim Cartmel on before. I've had Tom Bizio on before. And I think in various ways they've all had some connection to Vince Black, and Vince himself being quite a pioneer in the arts of, many arts, but specifically known for Xingyi Quan and Baguazhang in the USA, being one of the early guys that got into it.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned Wong Jackman, and I wanted to ask you a couple of things. I mean, some people who are savvy would probably know who Wong Jackman is. The name comes up if they know it. The first other name that immediately comes to mind is Bruce Lee.
Sure.
What was that like, training with Wong Jackman?
It was a very interesting experience. As I said, we started, my wife and I both started training together, the then girlfriend, now wife, started training together, and we did Northern Shaolin for about 3 years, and then moved over to training with Sifu Wong. And we, in the first 3 years that we trained, I mean, we learned that, there's 10 core sets for the Northern Shaolin system. His system also has about 5 supplementary forms you learn sort of as a build-up to the 10 core sets, and then a number of weapons, straight sword, broadsword, double broadswords, double straight swords, spears, et cetera, et cetera. So we had learned more or less that whole curriculum, and then we went and started studying with him, and he said, what do you want to do? And you've already learned everything. And we said, well, we'd like to just review it all, so why don't we start from the beginning? So we started from the beginning and we reviewed the whole system again from the top. And so we went through all the hand forms, all the weapons forms. Then he ended up teaching us some additional weapons forms, paired weapons, two-person forms. We did some Lo Han Quan and some Hua Quan with him. We did his 108 Taiji. But he was a very quiet man, very quiet teacher. He didn't talk very much, and was the class was very, how would I say, focused. Everyone came in, they did their thing. He would talk a little bit with each student. He'd come and teach a little bit, and then he would move on.
Right.
So it's not probably what people were, expecting. And sometimes he'd have guests come in. A lot of the people who are very well known in the, sort of Bay Area martial arts community might drop in and talk to him and hang out, and so it was very interesting.
He was also, I mean, I've seen him doing in photos. I've seen him doing a bit of Xingyi Quan as well. So he has some knowledge of Xingyi Quan as well, if I'm not mistaken.
He did teach Xingyi as well. We never learned the Xingyi with him, primarily because we were studying it with Vince at that time, and we didn't want to mix the two teachings and the two styles. But yeah, he did teach Xingyi to a lot of people. Some people also said that he knew Bagua, although I never saw him teach that to anyone. But then occasionally I would see him do something in the hallway and think like that looked a little bit like Bagua, but I never got any direct verification of that.
Right. And his system of northern Shaolin, or it came through southern China, correct?
Yes. So Guru Zhang, who's sort of the progenitor of that branch, after the 1928 Wushu competition, moved south to Canton and taught there. He had a number of students, and then his students relocated to Hong Kong in the 50s, and so that's when Wong was learning, and so he learned in Hong Kong and was there for actually he may have started in Canton, I can't recall actually now, but he learned that for a number of years, and then he immigrated to the US when he was quite young. So I think he came to the US when he was like 19.
And
then the whole dust up with and the whole dust up with Bruce Lee happened when they were like 22, right, or 23. I mean, they were both quite young.
Did he ever talk about that?
No, not with our students, and I only heard him mention it one time in class when sometimes you'd have people come into class and say they were interested in studying and they wanted to ask questions, and so he would talk to them. And only one time when I heard somebody bring it up in a conversation like that, And he just sort of laughed, and he was like, "Oh, that was such a long time ago. Who cares about that?" And then he moved on. And I know he gave one interview about it back in the '80s. There's a interview in Inside, what I think it used to be Inside Kung Fu, that he gave, but that was the only time that I know of. And of course, there was a series of articles in the Chinese Pacific Weekly back in the '60s, right after it happened, in Chinese. And those were sort of lost for a long time. And I actually ended up digging those out of the archives and translating those for my school brother, Rick Wing, who published a book. I don't know if you've seen the book, The Showdown in
I have.
I think it's called Showdown in Chinatown. Yeah. And so they're in there now. Those translations are in that book. So
was
that was
it
small
Showdown in
contribution to that.
Chinatown or Showdown? It was another area.
Showdown in Oakland, maybe.
Oakland, that's it. For Showdown in Oakland. Showdown in Oakland. That's awesome.
Because Bruce's studio was in Oakland at that time.
That's right. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, the portrayal in, for example, the Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. It's kind of a caricature. I mean, back then, who would have known? But if you get a little bit mature in martial arts, you kind of look at that and you think it's a caricature. It's over the top.
Sure.
So I'm sure. Sure. I just wonder what Wong Jackman thought of all of that and the way he was portrayed, or is it like a water off a duck's back for him? So.
Well, I think my impression, again, having never really talked about it with him, my impression was that it caused a lot of frustration with him right after it happened, because he felt like there was so much rumor and innuendo that nothing was ever set straight. And I think after the interview that he did in whenever it was, the mid 80s, 84, 85, I think the way that was portrayed and received, then I think maybe he just felt like he was done talking about it, like he didn't want to hassle with it. And of course, online people will argue about anything endlessly for whatever reason, even though they had no connection and no involvement. So now it's got a life of its own. I mean, interestingly, there was the movie that came out recently too. God, my memory is terrible today. Yeah, as I was saying, he was portrayed in this recent movie as the polar opposite of how he was portrayed in the earlier film, right? As at first he was a villain and this horrible person, and in the second movie he was portrayed almost as like this, sage monk who comes to America to, fix the problems and right the wrongs, and he was actually invited to participate in the sort of production of that movie. So I know he was on set a couple days when they were filming. And then they did a screening for him, and so he was, we went to the screening with a number of his other students, and he got to watch this story, which is partly about his life, which I always thought was very, must have been very strange feeling. But he was quite amused and I think impressed with that whole process.
I actually haven't seen that movie yet, and I remember when it came out, and then thinking I should watch this, and then I completely forgot about it. So I should get round to watching it again, or watching it for the first time.
I would suggest that it's an interesting counterpoint to the other narratives that come. It's also highly stylized, and as you said, from somebody who knows martial arts, they'll look at it as a caricature of these particular qualities.
Right. Well, that's quite interesting. I've also met another one of Wong Jackman's students just over the years in my involvement in different martial arts fields. I think he still teaches. His name is Scott Jensen, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so actually Scott is the person that we started with in Berkeley.
Oh, wow, okay.
Before we started studying with Sifu Wong. Yeah, so and he still teaches, I think, over in San Rafael, which is, north of San Francisco.
Yeah, I don't know. The last time I saw him was probably 7 years ago, and it was in Fremont. There was an event there, and he actually did some Xingyi there at the event. So, yeah, that was the last time I saw. But I chat to him every now and then, off and on over the years online. So, yeah. It's amazing how small the world is.
Exactly, yeah. There's connections everywhere.
Yeah. So you moved on from, well, before we move on from him, his system, which, maybe you can give a little bit of information of, does it have any resemblance to any of the Jinwu content at all? Is there any overlaps at all?
Well, the first form that usually he teaches to everyone is the 12-line Tantui form. and which I think is similar to what is taught in the Jingwu curriculum now. I think they also teach the 12-line version of the Tantui.
Yeah.
And it is in flavor, I would say it's very similar. There's some little distinctions, and certainly, I've seen different variations from, say, Taiwan or different parts of mainland China, but it's still pretty traditional. His Northern Shaolin was very, I would say, sort of open and expanded, right? Like he had these very long, elegant postures, and he was relatively tall. He was, I don't know, maybe 5'10", 5'11",
Okay.
and very thin and wiry. So he had a body that was very suited to sort of these long, open, Waijiachuan postures.
Right. Okay. And when you moved on onto your other learning from there on, did you continue? Do you still practice that content?
I do. Now, having talked about the number of arts that I've been involved in over the years, you can imagine that it's a lot of material. And so I obviously can't do everything all the time. And I kind of pick and choose. In the last few years, I've been spending more time on the Cheng-School Gao-Style Bagua. But I do occasionally go back and revisit my Shaolin or revisit my Lanshou. I've learned some other versions of Xingyi. I also studied with Liu Wanfu. For a bit, Vince brought him to the U.S. and he taught seminars over several months, and I translated for him. So I practice his versions of Elements and Animals occasionally. So I kind of try and keep a balance. Some things fall by the wayside. I haven't done any Lianjin Pu Bagua now in a long time because I've been focused on other things.
Well, there's only so many hours in the day anyway, so.
For sure. Yeah. So, but I do try and keep it up, and occasionally I teach it. I've taught it a little bit over the years, but honestly, it's hard to get people involved in, strenuous, long, extended, low stances. After a couple hours of that, they're like, boy, maybe I'll do something else.
Well, you could use your own history as a catalyst, get couples to come together because, you and your girlfriend started together and now you're married. So you could, I don't know, come up with a slogan. Couples that do mabu together, stay together, something like that. Yeah. No, I hear you. And I think today's day and age also, it's very hard to get people. How are you going to get somebody excited about struggling and suffering for an hour voluntarily, It's difficult. So everybody wants instant gratification or instant results or some instant, outcome out of whatever they do. And this is not the case with definitely not with classical Chinese martial arts. And I would say with styles like Xingyi and Bagua, it's even harder. It takes even more effort over a longer period of time to see a result. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. But, we try. And there are the few people who find their connection to it and keep persevering. So that's good. Those are the people that we're looking for.
Right. So how did you get on from there? Sorry, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that, you had said sort of as I moved on, but really I was kind of doing a lot of this stuff concurrently. So really I started doing the Shaolin in 95. I had the opportunity to go study with Liu Wanfu in 95 and 96, 96, 97. So that was relatively soon after. Vince was coming up to teach seminars starting in 95 and 96, or so pretty soon after we started training. And of course, at that time, I really didn't know anything, and I didn't know, who was well known in the martial arts world, or what those different styles were. I had some understanding from reading and just sort of seeing things over time, growing up in the Bay Area, but I didn't really know that much. So I was just kind of lucky that all these things fell into place, and so I was training really, Northern Shaolin, Xingyi, Bagua, Lanshou, kind of all at the same time for the first 3-4 years. And then as time moved on, then I started focusing more on the other arts. I started doing Gao-Style Bagua in 98 and, trained in that for a while. And then as Liu Shuhang started coming to the U.S. and, giving more seminars and teaching more actively, then I spent more time on that art and kind of, moved my focus around a little bit.
Right. So when you started doing your training with Vince, did you actually have an idea of these arts of Xingyi or Bagua, or was it just pure coincidence?
I had heard of them, only a little bit. I was more familiar with more of the external arts, right? Choi Foot, Hungar, different things like that. There's a ton of martial arts teachers in the San Francisco Bay Area, as you're probably aware, and many different styles, right? So, and some very well-known people as well. And so I had grown up sort of hearing about all this stuff. And I had heard of Xingyi and Bagua, but I didn't really know that much about it. And so it was just happenstance. Vince founded the association in 1990. And in 94, Dan Miller, who was the editor of the Baguazhang Journal, organized this group to go to China that Vince led, and it was about, 35 people or something. And Scott was one of the people who went on that tour. So he came back and then was starting to teach the association material there. And so it just happened that, he had made that connection just before we started training. And at that time, Vince was still actively traveling around the country doing seminars. So he was coming up to the Bay Area fairly frequently because he had a number of students in the area. And, each of them had their students. So it was a pretty sizable group. So he was coming up, I would say maybe 3-4 times a year to do seminars. And so we were just lucky enough that we could jump in. And that was sort of what got us into Xingyi. We were told like, oh, you should do Xingyi and Bagua, they're great. And we're like, yeah, Shaolin's enough, that's fine. But then we did the seminar with Vince, and we were like, wow, this is kind of amazing. Like, this is something we had not imagined, So those were really catalyzing opportunities, and he was just amazing to work with. So
right. Yeah, I mean, as I've said before on this podcast with other guests who had a connection with Vince, my teacher even told me about his time with Vince when Vince was here. And my teacher doesn't speak English, but he did say, big tall guy can really hold his liquor. That was like one of the first things that he said about Vince. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because to me, Vince was somebody I never met, but his name and the people that he's had connection to's names, their names are quite well known within the Xingyi and Bagua field in the USA. So I'd heard about it. He always seemed like a specter. I mean, there's very little that I actually know about the guy. He seemed to be everywhere but nowhere all at the same time. So it's interesting to hear these little tidbits. I'm sad that he's no longer with us because I'd hoped one day I'd be able to meet him. So, that's his life.
For sure. We're all sad that he passed so early, but, it's interesting that you say that, like, everywhere and nowhere, because I think that's, he would have enjoyed that description. I think he was so well connected and he knew so many people and had trained with so many people, but he did not promote himself. And so everything that was said was almost sort of like, secondhand rumors from somebody else, which then propagated in some weird way before the internet existed, right? So people still knew about him, even though there was no, social media to follow. It's interesting. And he knew, I mean, within the American martial arts community, I mean, so many teachers all around the country, either studied with him or did a seminar with him or, have met him, or it was all these connections. Again, it's like such a strange small world, even though it's spread out everywhere.
Yeah, and a lot of guys got their start and they went on to become quite well-known, teachers in their own right through their initial, whatever seeds it would be that Vince and his endeavors had planted. So it's quite interesting to see. And even down to one of the first English books I bought on Xingyi Quan, which was a translation of Sun Lutang's work on Xingyi Quan. If I recall, it was published by the Tang Shou Dao Association. So I think so, if I remember correctly. That was a long time ago. So yeah.
That is a long time ago, but it's interesting too. I mean, you talk about like the people who sort of got their seed with Vince, but also similar to a lot of the stories of sort of the old masters in China, where it's like these people who are already very accomplished martial artists coming to him and wanting to learn more, and then taking that and going off and doing something, right? Like, I mean, Tom Bizio, who you interviewed, right? I mean, Tom was already an accomplished martial artist when he met Vince. It wasn't like he was starting from scratch, and yet he came and found these things that he really wanted to explore with Vince because of whatever Vince could offer. So I mean, there is that aspect too. It's almost like the stories about people meeting the great master and coming to challenge and then being humbled, and then so I mean it's interesting.
Yeah, apart from your teacher, what was your first interaction with him like? Did you know what to expect? Were was it what you expected, or what was that like?
I did not know what to expect, and we were basically told, he's the most amazing martial artist, I've ever seen. You've got to come to the seminar. And so, we did. We just said, okay, great, we'll show up. So we showed up and didn't know anything about him. And then, and here now I'm going to sound maybe disrespectful, so hopefully no one, takes me to task. But in walks this guy who's got a long beard and a little bit of he had a belly, his chi belly, but it at first glance might look a little bit like a pot belly. And he had a number of years earlier, not that long earlier, he'd had a severe accident where he had damaged his spine a little bit. And so he's wearing a neck brace and using a cane. And so he came in, in a neck brace and a cane, and we thought like, oh, that's not the image of, a martial arts master. And then because it was actually a seminar on conditioning exercises, so it was what we call Fugong from our Xingyi system. So it was basically 4 hours of learning conditioning exercises. And so he was not in the shape at that point to demonstrate because he was still recovering from his injuries. So he basically just sat down and would tell people what to do and then make corrections. So it was a very kind of unique experience, but it was also amazingly eye-opening because we would go through these conditioning exercises and he would pick apart the exercise on so many different levels, right? And you'd be doing a push-up or a sit-up, and he'd be saying, okay, now this is what you're doing physically, but this is what you're doing, with the breath, and this is what you're doing with the sort of energy cultivation, and this is how it relates to generating power in Pichuan or in another form. So it was this really complex, detailed description of everything that we'd already been doing, for a while. I mean, we did always conditioning at the beginning of every class.
Well, I mean, it's just the hallmark of a teacher with refined knowledge. He can sit on a chair and throw out enlightenment even without moving, just with the correct. See, I always found a good teacher having two aspects. One is the knowledge and the skill and the mind that's developed that stuff. But the other aspect, which is equally important, is the mouth that's able to transmit that information as accurately and correctly as possible. So I find that sometimes you find a teacher with a one and not the other, and then it's problematic. But if you get a teacher that can do both, it's something else. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Vince was very skilled at using, imagery and metaphor in his teaching, which is very similar to how things are in Chinese, right? Like the language used can be very metaphorical. And sometimes when you translate that to English, then it comes across stilted, or, it comes across as just totally vague and bogus. And, unless you really work to try and, how do you rework that meaning to the English to not sound goofy? But, so Vince was really good at using imagery and metaphor, not by translating, but by like reinterpreting the thought into something that people could understand. And that was, I think, quite an amazing aspect of the way he taught. I mean, certainly there was the physical aspect, being able to demonstrate these things, but also being able to abstract that, and in the way that he explained it to people, right, was quite amazing.
Well, that's interesting, because I find that that's where it often falls short, and we'll get into the translating, which is one of the reasons I know of you. But that's often where it falls short, is that either the translation is too literal, or the translation is completely off, even with the explanation. And I found that it's actually a skilled art to be able to translate traditional Chinese martial arts, whether it be teachings or whatever the case may be, into English, but also get the correct meaning and idea across. Because as you've just mentioned, the name means one thing, but it carries a whole lot of underlying meaning that's important. And if that's not explained to you, then the name is meaningless. So I've always been of the thought that you can translate the name as best as possible that contains the original meaning of the name, but then you have to expand on what that means, particularly if it's in English for Westerners who don't have the cultural and philosophical understanding that a lot of Chinese people just have in general. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you got into translation, and how did you get into all of that and the language background?
So I graduated with a degree in Chinese from UC Berkeley, an undergrad degree in Chinese from UC Berkeley, and so that's where I started my language training. And I had started that essentially concurrently with training in martial arts, right? I was in college at the time, and so it's just sort of was natural that I had this opportunity to utilize the language when we went there to train, obviously, and then Vince recognized that my language was pretty good, so he would occasionally use me to translate things, either written or in person if he was somebody he wanted to talk to, and so gradually they just kind of melded together, where I was just doing both all the time. I mean, I was studying very hard in school, but I was using it quite a bit in the martial arts world. Translation as an undertaking for books, I mean, was kind of somewhat happenstance. One of the people who trained with us for a while, Jess O'Brien,
right,
who you probably know, who wrote the Neijia book.
Yes.
Jess had been encouraging me for a while to do some translation of Xingyi books. He kept saying, "Oh, there's all this great material out there, and it's just sitting there for no Western readers can utilize it." So he sort of convinced me to do that Xingyi book, which I will always have to give him credit for that, because it set the stage for being able to do the Gao book. I mean, the Xingyi manual, as you know, is very small. The original in Chinese is like 30 pages or something, and so it was a great experience for me to. I mean, it was difficult for sure, especially some of the introductions, which are very Wenyin, kind of construction. So it was a good experience for me to sort of get my feet wet in how do you translate that into language that sounds appropriate, right, and not stilted, and how do you try and massage those imageries or metaphors in a way that an English reader can understand. And I made huge mistakes in the first edition, so
the purple
live and
one.
Learn. Yes, the purple one.
I have both.
Some big mistakes. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And then, and I then found the revised edition. So we only had the small edition when we started, and then I had been doing some research on something else, and I ran across the revised edition, which is a little bit bigger, and I think actually the original one. So I think that was actually published first. And so then I figured, well, I should do a revised version, that incorporates all the rest of this material and then correct the mistakes. And so I tried to make the second version somewhat more, complete. But those two projects really set me up for working on the Gao book.
Which is massive.
Which is massive. I mean, in Chinese, it's massive. It's 2 huge volumes. And luckily, he only asked me to translate the first volume, because the second volume is like a photo reproduction of the original manual.
Yeah.
And so he approached, Liu Shuhang approached Vince about that and said, we've got this new edition, the 3rd edition now in Chinese, and we really want it translated into English. And, do you think you could help us make that happen? And of course, Vince said, sure. And then he said, John, you can make that happen, right? And so then he gave it to me, and they were like, great, so we'll see a draft of that like next week, right?
Yeah, they're always like that, aren't they?
Yeah, and so, but I put that, I put my head down, and I think that whole project, start to finish, was something like 20 months. I think it was like 13 months of translation, and then it was about 7 months of sort of editing and, layout and design and that kind of stuff. And
that's pretty fast, to be honest. I mean...
Oh, it was really fast, and looking back, I have no idea how I did it. I mean, I had a young son, I was working, so I would I would go to work every day, and then I'd go teach class, and then I'd come home and we'd cook dinner and whatever. And by the time the kid was in bed, it was 9:30, 10, and then I would start translating, and I'd translate till 2 or 2:30 in the morning, and then I'd collapse, and I'd get up again at 7 and start the whole thing over. And I did that for 13 months, and I would work weekends. I mean, sometimes I'd translate 12, 14 hours on a day on a weekend, just because that was when I had concerted time. And it's just over and over. So it was quite difficult. I remember many nights sort of like typing and translating and falling asleep while I was typing, and waking up and being like, wait, didn't I already translate that sentence?
Yeah. Well, the book itself, which I also have, is it's a great piece of work. So it's highly recommended to people. I'm not a Gao practitioner, and I really appreciate this book. So it wasn't time
I appreciate
wasted.
that comment.
Yeah, it wasn't time wasted.
Thank you very much. It's nice to hear.
So, I've actually just finished writing a book, and it's roughly the size of yours, but it's a translation of traditional Xingyi Quan classics that my teacher had, through his years of teaching me, would continuously repeat and give me copies of and explain and repeat. So it was never planned to be a book. It was just my notes, and then it just over 8-9 years it became a book, basically. So, and that was
Nice.
8-9 years, and it's about 400 pages. So it's about the size of your book, and you did this
Wow.
in 20 months, which is, I can't imagine trying to do it in a short period like that. So,
But I didn't have to write it, so that was good, right? I only had to translate. You had to create something, which is slightly different,
Well, yeah, it was translation of the classics and then explanation, which is 5 times as long as the original text. You know what
Right.
it's like. So,
Right.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting thing, though, and you mentioned it with regards to Jin Yun Ting's book that you translated. A lot of the, specifically with the Xingyi classics, they were never meant to be read without you having a teacher or some background or some knowledge. So, it's kind of taken for granted that the reader has a basic understanding of what they're reading, and this is more like reminder and key points that you should, be aware of in those particular texts. So, when translating it, and I'm sure you ran into this, you translate it, but it means nothing unless you have the background knowledge. So that's where my book actually was, because it was like, okay, that's nice, I understand what it means, but what does it mean in the big picture? Then you need to, elaborate on it. So it's quite interesting the way these older texts were.
Yeah, and many of them are also sort of mnemonics, right? So they're rhyming in a way that is facilitating your memorization in Chinese that can't happen in English, because you can never get the couplets to rhyme. So then it just becomes this sort of broken, ragged verse, which is, I think, disconcerting sometimes when people read it.
Yeah.
So it is without the background, and then there's, I think, with Chinese, there's a visuality of the characters that adds another layer that gets lost in the translation. Repetitions of certain imagery, whether it's wood radicals or sun radicals or whatever it might be, I think can also, even if they're not explicitly talked about, they can kind of surreptitiously in readers' minds evoke some kind of image or thought that's not there in the written English text.
Right. Yeah, but you also mentioned repetition, and that was done on purpose as well. So something would be repeated over and over, even in sections that are not like in more than one section. For example, like the 3 sections, and then if you go later on to the Cao Ji Wu sections, you'll see the same thing repeated, but then elaborated
Right.
with more on, and that was all deliberate. So that was all deliberate.
Right.
And also, from my understanding of the years of translating that, I found that it actually looks like it's one generation after the other just adding to this text, and then it becomes a new text on its own. That's why you find the same thing in older single sections, and then the same thing in bigger, like more elaborate sections, like Zhou Yao Lun, UFA's
Right.
9 Essentials Treatise. You'll see the same thing that you saw previously in other sections, and I think that kind of gives you insight as to how they remembered things, and then also that probably the longer text was later. It was just added to. So It's a very interesting
I think,
historical piece.
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of accretion over time of these things, and they're getting borrowed between different schools and lineages, and then slightly tweaked or reinterpreted. So you see different versions in different places, but they're very similar. And so yeah, you can compare and contrast. And I don't know if we could ever find out what how the source started and extrapolated out, but I certainly think that you're right. It kind of developed over time with students adding on as they went.
Yeah, and it probably started off like we start off in nursery school, hickory dickory dock, a mouse ran up a clock, something like that. And then it just gets added to because it wasn't written down initially, but it was, orally transmitted. And then somebody down the line learned how to read, and then he was like, well, let me try write that down, and it becomes hickory dickory sock, the mouse ran up a frock, and then you're like, oh, well, that's different, the next generation has changed one character there and one there, and then somebody's literate but not that literate, or the guy he's being dictated to has a heavy accent, and then you get five versions. So yeah,
I mean that issue has come up, and I've talked about this a lot with other people who do translation of sort of oral materials. Is somebody's going and talking to Sun Lutang or some famous teacher, and they're listening to every word he says, and then they go home and they write it all down, but because of the accent, they got one of the characters wrong, which is not uncommon, right? It happens all the time, and then that changes the meaning. But because those kind of things happened, generation over generation, now it's a little bit unclear where the original text lies. Sometimes you can ferret it out. A while back, I had started this project on the Neigong Sijing, right? And I was going to try and look at those and maybe translate those. Liang Katren had talked a lot. He was teaching, and he wanted us to maybe work on some translation. So then I thought, okay, let me look at the extant versions that are out there. So I went and collected, I think I found maybe 8 or 9 different versions. And, there was no textual consistency across any of them, right? They all had different characters in different places and changed the meaning significantly. And there was no way really to trace which one was earlier, so it became this sort of guessing game of which one is the authentic, Neigong Sijing.
We're not even sure if that's a Xingyi text. So that's the other difficulty. So I mean, it's not in my lineage. We don't study the Neigong Sijing. It's mostly out of the Shanxi and the Song family in particular that really focuses on that. But I found it a very interesting cultural piece, to understand philosophical ideas of that permeate Chinese martial arts and Chinese culture, and it's as a cultural study. So I actually did translate it for this book, but again, as a person who doesn't have learning in it directly through my teacher. It was a text that we had, but it wasn't something that we focused on, and it was extremely hard translating. So that's the one part of the book that I would I'd tell everybody, if there's any misunderstandings from people that are deeply in this practice, I can fully understand where I might have gotten something wrong. But for the most part, as a philosophical text, a lot of that background and that information I was familiar with. So, it was. And I think it's important to, I mean, as I said, as a cultural study for Chinese martial arts, again, people that are doing Xingyi and Bagua should realize that you're doing a cultural study as much as you are doing a martial study. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I like to think that, some of the texts are vague and sort of, allegorical in the way they're laid out, but I think that they're done on purpose that way, right? Like if you concretely tell person do this and only this, then their mind locks into that framework and then they can't expand beyond it. But if you give them something which is somewhat contradictory and somewhat vague and maybe is not quite clear, it forces them to ponder and to reconsider and to go back and restudy again. And so then that becomes in itself like a learning aid rather than just like do ABC. And then everybody goes, great, I got ABC, I'm done. And, something that is a little more mysterious helps want to bring people back to relearn and rethink about what they're practicing. So I think that's also beneficial to the training.
Yeah, you nailed it. These books these texts are not supposed to be how-tos. They're supposed to be something that you keep going back to throughout your development in the art. Keep going back to. And I think that's on purpose, as you said. So, yeah, it's something that it's not like, oh, I've read that book. It's not like, I don't know, a novel. It's not something you've read that book and then it stays on the bookshelf. It's more like something you'd refer to over and over again.
And I still go back constantly to the Gao manual and reread pieces of it, even though I translated it. But I reread sometimes the English and sometimes the Chinese.
Yeah.
And I reread them and I find new pieces to think about. Partly just because of where I may be at in my training.
The entire book itself. I mean, just if I can ask you if you can recall. For example, the sections on the Baguazhang history and development and all of that, was that in the original manual, or is this all subsequently added content? Was there any content that you added in terms of from your own research, for example, history aspects, etc.? Or yeah.
So yeah, that's a great question. So the history section, all that was added in the later editions. So the original manual that was produced by Gowie Shang, contained the descriptions of the turning palms, also called the 8 big palms, the post-heaven palms, the animals. He also had a bunch of material in there that is now not considered part of the true curriculum. There's these 13 excerpted postures, and there's some other, leopard and all these other things that were in there. And then there was a section on sort of, cultivation exercises and longevity exercises. That was the extent of the original manual as it was published in whatever 32 or 36, whenever he finalized it. And then it was kept in that form just by Liu Fengzai, and nothing was done with it until the late 80s. And then they decided they wanted to make people aware of what was there. So then they took that material and they sort of condensed it down and did a very slim version that talked just about the turning palms and the pre-heaven palms. And that was the first edition.
Okay.
And then each subsequent edition, they sort of expanded. So in the 2005 edition, they included all of the post-heaven palms and the weapons. And then in the 2010 edition, they added the animals. And then in the last two editions, then Liu Shuhang and Liu Fengzai and the other editors who were involved were also adding sections on history and, philosophy and those kind of things. I didn't add anything myself. I just did the straight translation of the most recent edition. And I know that his son, Liu Lingjie, is now working on some text related to the weapons. And so I don't know if they're thinking about expanding in another revised edition, or if they'd like to do separate books about the weapons. That's a whole sort of separate endeavor. If you want to start diving deep into the weapons, each of those could be a fairly thick book.
Yeah, they should do it separately, because if they're going to add more to this book, it's going to become such a big, cumbersome book. It's going to be
right.
Yeah, it's best to just this book, I think, leave it as is and then add additional books is probably the best way. So yeah, I recall that in the history section, reference was made to Kang Gowu's research on Donghai Chuan and the origins of Bagua. So what is Liu Shuhang and their opinion of his research?
Well, I know Liu Laoshi has worked with him, pretty extensively. He was, I think, partly responsible for helping to sort of establish the Cheng-School Gao-Style Bagua as a separate lineage, right, that was distinct from the Cheng-School. And, if you look at the history section, they talk a little bit about that, because in the 30s, they were just calling it, Roshen Lian Huanzhang. It was just, twisting body, connected palm. And it wasn't until the 80s when they were working on that first edition that they decided to try and really identify a name that described the structure of their art and how it was different than something else. And they came upon it because they realized that the origin really came from Chengtinghua, right? The 8 big palms and some of the initial post-heaven palms are really straight from the Cheng lineage. But Gowie Shang adapted it and modified it enough that it became sort of a separate flavor. And so they wanted to honor, the Cheng school. And I think that Kang Gawu was kind of, at least partly responsible for wanting to recognize that lineage.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the right way to go about it as well. I mean, it should be recognized on its own, but at the same time, you're recognizing its root and where it came from. So it is distinctly different from the standard Cheng style. Well, I hate to use that word, the standard Cheng style. I mean, every second Cheng person you look at is different. But that's just the case with Bagua in general. But this, I think,
sure.
And I think it when I was with my last guest from Taiwan, who I think Zhang Yukai.
I know of him. I've never met him in person.
Oh, okay. You've never met him. Yeah, I think he kind of alludes to this in that as well. He finds that the Gao system was a system, a deliberate systemization, which organization and systemization. So that's a good thing, and I think it's a logical progression for martial arts to do that. Especially by more astute practitioners. They want to kind of put things in a logical order and progressive, analyze the most effective progression, process for it to teach, etc., etc. So, and that's what happened with us. So it's great.
Yeah, and Gowie Shang, is responsible for that sort of systematization of the art, right, and expanding on the individual post-heaven applications until there were 64 of them, and then creating these two-person forms that go along with all the 64. So what they call, or we call, the dismantling palms, the chaishou. So that was quite I think an amazing achievement just in and of itself, right, like coming up with that structure. And then, of course, he put it together with all these components. So it really now is a very structured system. You've got, the pre-heaven palms, well, you've got the moving posts, right, the xingzhuang, and then you've got the pre-heaven palm, then you've got the 64 post-heavens, the 64 associated two-person forms, then you've got, the 8 animal forms and the weapons forms. And so each of these sort of subsystems within the larger system, but they all tie together. And they all have a lot of overlap in the way that they're structured, the moves of the forms, and it's a pretty amazing accomplishment, and certainly something that makes me wonder, like, how anyone could be that astute and that creative, in their limited lifespan, to be able to put that all together.
Yeah. I mean, that's no small task for sure. But like I said, then you get certain people that are, martial geniuses that are able to do this and do it correctly. So, it's not common, but it needs to happen. So that's why I think recognizing it on its own is, if this was Kang Wu involvement there as well, it's important. I've had many discussions with Kang Wu. He's a very close friend of my teacher's. So, but over the years, what I have found about him, like, he's less and less, he's more and more reluctant to go on, for example, public record and say things. I wanted to interview him a few times. He's like, no, my work. You know what I have to say. You can just, you can just put it out. She's like, no, I'll come and visit you and I'll ask you a couple of questions and we'll film it. No, I don't feel like it. He's become more reluctant in that regard. So he is, retired. He's old. So I guess he's just over it in that sense.
Well, and I think, there was a sort of flourishing in the 80s of sort of researching martial arts lineages in China, right? Like discovering all the different branches. And I think that was very productive for the community. And then everyone was, trying to uncover, history and manuals and whatever teaching methods. I think that was good. But then it becomes something about, like, well, we're going to establish a lineage and create a separate identifier, right? There's 316, officially recognized schools of martial arts in China. Yeah, something like that. And so, so then everybody wanted to have their own recognized style. So then it becomes somewhat of a political thing, right? Like then having to adjudicate, what is a separate style versus just your flavor of something becomes more problematic. So I can see where maybe he wouldn't want to be involved in that. I don't think I would want to be involved in that.
Yeah. Well, look, I worked with the official organization and with him for some years. And I can understand how after some years you just want to, either blow the place up or shoot yourself in the head. So, I fully understand him. He did actually write the preface for my book. So that was nice of him. But, I I really wanted him to. I had some questions. The same questions that keep getting misrepresented by, for some reason, old and settled questions in the art are still being questioned in the West. And I'm like, you know what? Let me go to the horse's mouth and literally get him to say these on record. And he was like, yeah, I don't feel like doing that. So
such as what kind of questions are coming up?
just like, oh, Dong Haitran didn't invent Bagua,
Yeah.
As far as we know, and as far as any evidence leads to, and tracing lineages, it does. It's a settled thing, So things like that, and he did the footwork. Kangu didn't he wasn't just repeating things or just saying what he felt saying. He actually did the footwork. He has, and that's the thing. If you sit down and talk with him, as I have over the years, it's not even. It's for him. It's so clear. He can explain it to you with all the little details and all the facts that, if you say no, well, what about this lineage? And he'll tell you the people and how they connect back. So
right.
It's very interesting. But for some reason, well, I guess that's part of the intrigue in particularly in Chinese martial arts is this weird opaqueness that seems to. That people are interested in. I guess if they're interested in that and that makes them practice, okay, so be it. So.
Yeah, and each generation also has to kind of rediscover everything for themselves. Even though they're told this is what happened, then people go, well, that's not right, and then they want to rediscover it. And eventually someone will do the same, footwork and get to the same conclusion, and then make a statement, and then that'll be settled for a while. And then a new generation will come along and want to revisit it for some reason.
Right.
I think that's also common.
Yeah. So we're jumping around. We've covered these books that you translated. Are you working on any others, or are you taking a much needed break from that?
I'm working a little bit on a couple projects, but unfortunately, it's been so hectic with life and work and everything else. They've been kind of put to the back burner. And so I'm not sure when they'll get there. And unfortunately, one of the authors who I wanted to sort of talk more and ask questions about passed away. My teacher, Li Runxi. And so, then that makes it more difficult because then I have to kind of make choices on my own and, which is never as productive. I mean, certainly I can talk with my school brothers and sisters and we can debate things, but it's not as good as going to the author. So I have a couple little projects like that I'm working on, but I don't know if anything is going to come out soon.
Yeah, well, condolences on your loss. It's a terrible thing. Over the last few years, I think a lot of the older generation Chinese martial artists, particularly that I knew here, have passed away since the beginning of the pandemic up until now, a whole bunch. So, time goes on, waits for no one. And that's one of the regrets and the tragedies of this lockdown and the pandemic that we had over the last 3 years was while we were separated from these people and unable to see them, some of them passed away and we never got that chance back. So it's just terrible thing. Yeah. What was the teacher that you mentioned now? What is his background? What are you working on? Was it a book he wrote? I know you said you're not sure it'll finish, but can you give some information?
Yeah, so Li Runxi was the son of Li Guizhang, and Li Guizhang is from Taiyuan. It was fairly well-known Xingyi, Taiji teacher, and Vince studied with Li Guizhang in the 80s. And spent a lot of time in Taiyuan with him and had wanted to reconnect with him and his family, but wasn't able to go back and see him before he passed away. And then it was a number of years and we sort of lost touch with his son. So he sent a few students to China to try and reconnect with Li Runxi and kind of bring him back into into our sphere. And I was able to go over there in maybe 2004 and located him and reestablished that connection. And then we started bringing Li Laoshe to the U.S. to teach their style of Xingyi. And so I learned his version. I mean, I learned the Shanxi versions that Vince taught, and then I learned the version that Li Runxi taught, and then practiced both of those for quite a long time. I started with him in 2004, and then he came and took a number of disciples in 2006, and then came pretty regularly up, until COVID hit. And he had written some sort of explanations of some of the more, not esoteric really, but some of the philosophy and theory behind the 5 elements and their practice that was sort of kind of similar to, sounds like what you're writing with your book, right? A little bit of a description of like, this is what the classics say, but this is really what it means, physically as you're training. And so he had written some things. It's a fairly short book. It's maybe about 40 pages or something. But I thought might be an interesting kind of primer for Xingyi that's different than the other Xingyi books that are out there.
That sounds interesting, for sure. For some reason, the name Liu Chang is making me think of a book that came, if I might be remembering incorrectly, a book came out about breathing methods that was translated into English.
Yeah, the Tuna, that was through Tom Bizio.
Right, so it is one of his books, right? Tuna Siba, I think it was.
Tuna Siba, yeah. So
okay.
That's his student Song Zhiyong, Song Zhiyong, taught the breathing exercises, and I actually learned those as well a little while back, and haven't practiced them very recently. I know Tom put that book out. That's been a while now. Put that out about, 8 years ago, something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
I mean, of course, Liu Chang was very well known in the martial arts community in China, and his lineage through Dong Xiusheng was fairly well known and fairly recognized. Yeah. And Vince worked a lot with him and really spoke highly of their lineage and their training methods. So it was really great to be able to reconnect with his son and study with his son. It was really an honor.
Yeah, that is great. I mean, additionally, I mean, Vince, like his initial learnings in Xingyi and Bagua through the Taiwan lineages. So it was Zhang Junfeng derived down from there. Yes.
Yes, he studied with Xu Hongji, and Xu Hongji was a student of Gowie Shang, who was a student of Zhang Junfeng.
That's right. Okay. So what got, if you ever asked this question, I'm not sure if you did, what got Vince interested in coming to China to look into the Gao and other lineages, and even Liang and all the other styles that he got involved in?
Well, that was his teacher, Xu Hongji, who told him, when I'm gone, you need to go to, he called it Big China, mainland China. You need to go to Big China, and you need to seek out, the real lineages of these arts, because there's more than what I've taught, right? And so Vince was, in many ways, very traditionalist in his upbringing and his way of thinking. And so Xu Hongji told him that's what he had to do, so that's what he had to do. So then he made a concerted effort to go and travel all over China and, meet as many people as he could and try and seek out people, who had a certain level of facility and also could teach, something a little bit more along the lines of the traditional method. I think, if I remember correctly, I think that Xu Hongji also said, like, don't study with anybody who's under 50. Go find somebody, go find people who are older and study with them. And so, Vince was able to meet a number of people and traveled pretty extensively across China and ended up working with, with Liu Chang and obviously with Li Ziming, Wang Shatong, and then of course met Wang Shusheng and Liu Shuhang in Tianjin and started working with the Gao family. So he really made a lot of amazing connections, and really all of the people that I've met, all of the opportunities that I've had, are only because of the efforts that he made in going and seeking out this material and establishing these connections and then creating this association, which has allowed so many people to benefit,
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, it even affected me in my path, because the first book I bought came out of his association. I mean, one of the first books in English. So, yeah, he had a profound effect. So it's almost as if, he was doing a journey for his own learning, but he's done a service to the entire Western community for these arts. Because like I said earlier, he had such an impact even on people that became prominent teachers in their own right later on, in their initial trips there, their initial learnings, etc. I mean, I think there's still video you can find of some of those early trips on YouTube.
Yes, there's a couple of them out there, which are pretty interesting to watch.
Yeah.
People that I know, that I still train with, seeing them, 35 years ago.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of photos as well from those times too, with my teacher, with Vince and Tom, doing Guanshou Dao, our rolling hand broadsword and other stuff too. So yeah, it's just interesting. Again, like the size of the world, because I had no clue that my teacher had interaction at all with Vince. I did have the book though, Sun Lutang's book from years before, and then in the early days, I'm training with my teacher and I'm at his home, and he pulls out a photo album, and I'm like, isn't this Tom? And I said, do you know these two guys? And my teacher, like I said, he doesn't speak English, so I just said, Tom. I was like, yeah, that's Tom Bizio. And I had Tom Bizio's tooth from a tiger's mouth many years ago when I was still at early 20s martial artist getting injured all the time, that book was basically in my backpack because I was injured so often, so it was something that I was always looking into to get some reference from. And then there's Vince in there in photos too, and I'm like, this it's just strange how small the world is, specifically the martial arts world. So
yeah, well, Vince always spoke very highly of Di Guoyong, and he actually, I traveled to China quite a lot over the years for work, various things aside from training martial arts, and he asked me actually one time to go look up Di Guoyong and bring him a gift. And I think that the address that I had was, probably several years out of date, and so I went to where it was supposed to be, and I wandered around and asked many people, and nobody could, locate where the building was gone, and
the building was demolished.
And nobody could tell me where residents had moved or anything. So I lost that, and I was only passing through on that trip for 3 days or something. And then that I just lost track of that. Vince always talked very highly of him and a number of Li Ziming's other disciples. Yeah. Of course, he worked really closely with Zhang Huasan.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of the original 8, there's only 3 still alive. So,
wow.
It's Di Guoyong, Zhao Dayuan, and Wang Tong. The rest of the original 8 are gone.
Yeah, so, I mean, he talked a lot about Zhao Dayuan and Wang Tong as well. And I met Zhao Laoshe when he was in San Francisco teaching, which was a great experience to listen to him talk.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I mean, this past Qingmingjie, the Tomb Sweeping Festival, both of them couldn't attend, so it was also kind of surreal. My teacher's not there, Wang Tong's not there, Zhao Dayuan's not there. It's basically, those are the last 3 of that generation, by a couple, there's a couple of others, but from that first group of 8, in this, and they all weren't there, so it was just, and it's the first time we've done this since the pandemic started, so it's just, you kind of realize the clock is ticking,
Yeah, this is very true, and I was having this conversation with one of my school brothers not too recently fairly recently, that now there's a whole generation of people who are not going to ever meet Vince, and not have that interaction with him. They're not going to meet all these other disciples of Li Ziming, and so now those names to them are also sort of an imaginary, right? It's the same as if you talk about, Li Luonong or, Li Cunyi, right? Like it's a name that exists in the midst of history.
Yeah.
I don't know how old you are, but I'm getting up there and I'm starting to think like, oh, now they have to deal with me, like the teachers have to deal with me, and they're not going to get to go see these elder generation people. So what do I do to make that a more productive experience for them and a more thoughtful experience for them? Obviously our teachers put a lot of energy and time into the way they taught us, and so how do I replicate that again?
I hear you. I mean, I spoke to my teacher 3-4 days ago, And he's in Australia with his daughter right now, and he's been there for most of the pandemic, actually the whole pandemic period. And he's like, I've been watching him, I'd call him once every couple of weeks. We'd have a video call, and I've seen him actually age even just on those video calls over the last. What I found as well, though, I think a lot of these teachers and these martial arts, these older generations, the fact that they were going down, training every morning, every weekend, or during the week we'd be there a few days in the week, and every weekend we'd be there training. It kind of keeps them young, And when you take that away from them, they're like stuck in their apartments, locked down in a pandemic, unable to teach. Then they suddenly age quickly, And I spoke to him the other day, and he said, there's in Hebei, Li County, there's a 30th anniversary of this Chuojiao Association. They want him to go.
Oh, yeah.
So they want my teacher to go, but he's there, so he wants me to go represent him. I'm like, really? I mean, are we at that? Are we? And then you sit back and you think, yeah, but my age and how long I've been with him, so I can
right.
kind of understand, So, but like that just shows you the clock is ticking, right? So. Yeah.
Yes, well, we do what we can, but it does show you the truth. There was a saying that came from Shu Hongji that Vince would always repeat, which was, train every day, and I promise you good things will happen.
Yeah.
So that just goes to show you got to just put in the effort every day, even if it's a little bit. Don't let it creep up on you where you start to lose it.
Yeah, exactly. So you keep adding little drops into the bucket every single day. So.
Yep.
Yeah. And what is your? Are you teaching at all, or are you just occasionally teaching, or what is your involvement?
So I was teaching classes pretty regularly, up until about 10 years ago, and then I kind of scaled back a little bit. So the last few years prior to the pandemic, I was teaching a couple nights a week. I had a sort of combined Xingyi Bagua class in the local area, in the Bay Area there. And, it was smallish. I mean, I had maybe at the max, I had like 9 or 10 people, so not a huge class. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. Everything went to hell. So I was teaching online for a while for just a few students who wanted to keep going. And then after the sort of on the tail end of the pandemic, I started getting lots of requests to teach kids classes because I think people wanted their kids to like get out of the house and get exercise. So we actually started teaching kids classes around 2021 and sort of, late 2020, early 2021. And so I was teaching kids classes for quite a long time, right up until, I had to come to Japan. So right now I'm teaching remotely. I've got a handful of students that I do online stuff with to kind of keep their practice going. And I'm hoping when I return to the Bay Area to get back to sort of more regular classes.
Teaching kids is an interesting thing. And what do you find in teaching kids? I mean, are you teaching, is there any specific curriculum that you find is suitable more to them than something else?
Well, my wife and I put together a curriculum that is really based on a lot of the fundamentals of the different arts, but no particular art in general, right? So a lot of the stance work, a lot of the stepping methods, hand movements, blocking methods, striking methods. So things that can be taught in a short amount of time and can be repeated, right? Repetitive movements that don't require a lot of memorization. We do teach some forms. So we started teaching, I started using Wubuquan, right? Like the introductory wushu form, just as a way to get the kids moving. When we started it, we were just responding to interest from people that we knew. And so the class was like kids from 6 up to like 15, right? So it was really just way too unruly to do any one thing. And certainly as time went on, we learned to kind of like separate the kids by ages. Once they get above maybe 10 or 11, then you can make them learn, tantui or some other form, which requires a little bit more work on their part. But really at the younger ages, it's just about getting them moving and trying to see, that they have proper development. But it's really great to watch them go from, gangly and awkward to actually moving in a way that looks like they're doing some martial technique, even though they don't know the meaning behind it, but they're learning to coordinate their body, they're learning to breathe while they move. And that part has been really great. So I've actually quite enjoyed teaching the kids, and hopefully
Okay.
I can continue that on.
Yeah, hopefully some of them continue and then they get older and then they can go deeper into one of the, Xingyi or Bagua or whatever other system they want to go deeper into. So, yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
I mean, one of Li Song, the teacher that I mentioned before, who in Shandong that we do the Tai Chi with, his big thing is really it should be sort of a family affair. So their group is quite large, and they have whole families where they've got kids training and parents training, and
Oh, wow.
they make it sort of a whole family kind of thing. And I would love to replicate something like that where I'm at. It's difficult in the sort of Western, hyperactive Bay Area kind of lifestyle to get people to commit to that.
Right.
But I would love to replicate something like that where the whole family gets some benefit and they all can train and feel healthy.
Yeah, that is a great way, especially if, they, like you said, they come together, then even if it's once or twice a week, it's just something that the family does together. So there's that incentive that makes them do it, that it's a family gathering as opposed to just somebody doing martial arts. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll see how things evolve once I'm back in my normal environment.
What are you doing in Japan, if I can ask?
I just had some family issues to deal with my wife's family, so we had to be
Is she
here
Japanese?
for a little while. Yes.
Ah, okay, now it makes sense. All right, no, I thought maybe you were just Yakuza. So, yeah, I'm glad that. All right, okay, so yeah, so you have family in Japan. That's great. Did you ever look up any of the Xingyi and Bagua people there at all?
A little bit. I did talk a little bit with one of the teachers who teaches Xingyi here, and there's a number of different groups in the area. I haven't really had time to explore and see what they do. Things here tend to be very sort of closed off too. So if you're not going to go and like join the group, it feels like people don't really want to spend as much time talking to you.
Right.
But I also haven't put a lot of effort into reaching out to people. And there's people around the area who teach various things. And there's a gentleman that I've seen online who teaches in the park near our house. So I mean, I could go reach out to him, but I have not wanted to interrupt his classes or whatever, and I just have been sort of too busy myself to really focus on it.
Okay, yeah, I know Simon Lockett, who's been on the podcast.
He's the one, yeah.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
Yeah, Simon teaches at the park near our house. I've never met him, but I've seen the podcast or listened to the podcast, and I've seen some of his videos and stuff. But we watch his class occasionally if I'm walking through the park, but I try not to interrupt, and just haven't taken the effort to go and establish something. I probably should.
Yeah, he studied with Feng Zhengbao. Feng Zhengbao passed away, I would say, 2 years ago. Another one that we lost during that period. Another guy that I had wished I could have met, but no, he's gone now. So yeah, but he studied with him, and then he also studied here in China. So with Shi Shu. So yeah, Simon's a good guy.
Right.
Go say hi. I don't know if he's teaching specifically what Shou taught him, or if he's teaching a combination of what he learned previously from Feng as well. But I know the Yin style is what Shu's system was classified as, and that's probably what they're teaching, what he's teaching. So.
Right. And there are some other, I mean, I know there was a Lianjin Pu group in Tokyo. There was a Cheng-School Gao-Style Bagua group in Tokyo, but I'm not sure how active they are now. I've done a little bit of internet sleuthing, and I see bits and pieces, but it's hard to tell how actively they're teaching.
Yeah. I'm that side of the world. I'm not too familiar with a lot of the people, so I do know that they are, as you mentioned, these groups, and I do know that in the past the Japanese groups in general were quite passionate about these arts, but in more recent history, I don't know what those groups are like. So, yeah. But you've got some time you could maybe go through. I know that when you're visiting a country, even if you're there for a couple of months, it sounds like a long time, but you've got a lot to do and you really have no time. So, Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately. And work keeps going, so.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been interesting to catch up. I don't want to take up your whole night. I'm really happy that we finally got in contact and had this discussion. You were always a name on a book cover for a bunch of the books that I own, so I'm glad I finally got to sit down and talk to you. Thank you for your work that you did on these books. I think they're a great asset to the practitioners in the West. So I think if they don't have them, they should go out and get your books. And thanks for coming on.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for the kind words. It's always nice when people appreciate the books you translate. And I'll look forward to seeing your book when it comes out in print as well.
I'll let you know. It's almost there. I'm just finalizing the hardcover layout. So there's a bit of gutter size issues. So once that's done, it'll be good to go. I think you'll find the cover interesting. I'm not going to give too much information about it, but it was about 4 months of work to make that image on the cover. But once it's out, I'll let you know.
Excellent. I'll look forward. Well, thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Bye.